Hi, welcome back to another episode of Real-World Serverless, a podcast where I speak with real-world practitioners and get their stories from the trenches. Today, I'm joined by Palo from Alma Media. Hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Ari, we met at the AWS Community Summit in Stockholm a while back. How have you been since then?
Fine, thanks for asking. Well, all things serverless, working with those.
Yeah, so we've been having some discussions of the podcast, and you guys are doing some pretty amazing things with serverless, I would say. For the audience who are not familiar with Alma Media, can you just give us a brief introduction, what you guys do, and what is your role there?
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll start with Alma Media. It's a European media and digital services company, and we basically operate in Finland, Sweden, and Eastern Central Europe. We have three different business units that have their separate focuses, but generally speaking, we do all sorts of stuff regarding housing, recruitment, cars, news, entertainment, lifestyle, travel, cooking, dating, and business media, and like professional training and data services. So that's a lot. That's a lot, and it's both business to customer and business to business. And we have something like 100 plus websites and apps and things like that. So it's a lot that, but usually those areas they sort of support each other quite well. So that's our sort of business case. And yeah, we have about 280 developers in total in multiple teams. And then my role in the whole of that is that I work in the Alma ICT unit as a solution architect, and our unit basically provides these, shared services that are used across the company and APIs, and also the data platform and analytics and single sign-on. And personally, because we work quite closely with all our different teams, there are many teams in Alma development teams. So I get to sort of share these best practices between them. So I'm in some sense you could say I'm an in-house developer advocate. So that's it in brief.
Yeah, I think, and I remember you mentioned that some of your websites are some of the biggest websites in Finland as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. They are. I mean, we have tight competition. We are sometimes at the second place and sometimes in the first place, like from the Finnish Finnish websites, like regarding how many weekly visitors there are, and there are other like we have other positions there as well. So they're definitely in Finland. They are really high usage websites, and we reach about 80%, almost 80% of like Finnish population. So that's quite a big reach here in Finland.
So for some of these more popular websites, are they fairly high traffic? What sort of the sort of peak TPS do you guys see on some of your websites?
Yeah, I don't have a TPS number at the moment, but I could say that we get like a regular month would be something like 750 million page views, somewhere around that. Of course, there are times when there are like some really massive news and there's some high peaks and things like that, but around that 750 million page views month.
Okay, and I think you mentioned that some of that backend, some of the APIs is more and more now becoming serverless at Alma Media as you guys have been on this really long journey moving things into serverless. Is that right?
Yeah, we actually, well, we started with AWS in 2012, and I think our first serverless implementations were in 2016. And the regular ones, of course, they were the usual ones, like infrastructure glue with Lambda and some small APIs and things like that. But nowadays, for example, the web frontends are implemented with serverless quite a lot. For example, one of the projects that we're probably the most proud of were a couple of years ago. Alma Talent business unit decided to rewrite their website front ends again, and they have pretty big websites. Some of the biggest ones get almost 2 million weekly visitors, and they decided to go with the React.js library. And performance was a quite big played a quite key role in the project, and they wanted to use the React.js server side rendering. So the server builds up the HTML and sends it to browser, and then the browser downloads the HTML, and then the React.js client-side framework kicks off and continues from there. So they did that, what do you call universal React.js or server-side React.js rendering. So they did that, but with actually serverless with AWS Lambda. So that was probably the one of the biggest like moments that they did that, and it's working still, and it's working great.
So that's quite interesting because one of the problems that a lot of companies run into when it comes to using serverless for user-facing features like websites and things like that, especially when it comes to server-side rendering, is that okay? We are gonna get cold starts from time to time. Do you guys experience that problem, or do you have such a constant, stable traffic that you don't really see cold starts often anyway?
I'd say that in most cases, and in that previous example, for example, is that the traffic is most of the time somewhat constant. That there is always some traffic at least coming. So the cold start weren't such a big issue. At least it wasn't. Maybe it was in the start, but at least it isn't anymore. Of course, now you have provisioned capacity and things like that. But at least for those websites, it wasn't. Have been some cases that people have, for example, used like JVM based languages like Java or Kotlin to build some APIs with AWS Lambda, and there the cold stars have been a problem. But in Node.js and Python and Go and runtime environments that we mostly use, it hasn't really been that huge of a problem.
I guess with JavaScript, the code styles has gotten a lot better, and it wasn't that bad to begin with. Especially for your case, if you have pretty stable traffic that's keeping all the containers warm anyway, it's probably not that big a deal, I imagine. But are you guys doing anything special to optimize the performance of your functions anyway? Are minimizing the packages using Webpack and things like that?
There might be someone doing that, but I don't think we don't really use that Lambda optimization with Webpack or similar tools. We don't use that really much. I'd say one of the things I personally use is the Lambda Power tuning library that sort of triggers the step functions that also test your functions against various configurations. So I've used that to sort of find a sweet spot for the Lambda runtime, that how much memory and things like that I provide to it. So I've used that kind of a setup, but not really. Then it's usually sometimes we've done an optimization where we had like let's call them micro functions, that there are multiple really small functions, and sometimes there has been a situation that only few of those gets called often and rest are not called that often, but when they're called again, and they have the cold start issue there. So we have done in several projects that we've sort of combined to move towards a bit, some people might call it like monolithic Lambda, that the Lambda function that contains a bit more logic than your just one function, actually, that there can be multiple handlers and things like that. So we've done that combination trick few times to sort of mitigate that problem with cold starts.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because I find that approach only works when you don't have a lot of traffic because you condense the number of cold starts that's required across multiple endpoints because you have just one function that handles them. But the moment you have a fair number of traffic that's spread across different endpoints, you kind of lose the benefit from doing that condensation. At least that's been my experience so far.
Yeah, and we haven't done that really on the larger traffic sites. Usually the sites that or the endpoints that have the larger traffic amount, they have really the Lambda function optimized for the actual or the main use case, let's say like that. But some projects that have like several Lambda functions and not that much traffic, but it's still required that there shouldn't be like that much cold start. They have used that, and I don't have any numbers, but I've heard that it has helped them out.
Okay, and I guess nowadays you have the provision concurrency anyway, so you don't really need it anymore.
Yeah, that was a good addition from AWS. That definitely that I haven't personally used that yet, but I see several use cases for it.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that you mentioned the power tuning as well. And it's a bit of a shameless plug here. Anyone who's listening and want to try out the power tuning app, you can also try out the Lumigo CLI, which is a CLI tool that I built. It's got a command that will deploy the power tuning step function and then run against your Lambda function as well. And you can also embed it as part of your CI/CD pipeline so that you can auto optimize your functions after you run different configurations and see which the best memory allocation for your function.
Yeah, I haven't used that tool myself. Yeah, I haven't used that tool myself, but I have to say that I've seen it, and I really recommend everyone to try tools like those, because that really, you can't really predict where, in which kind of an environment your Lambda is going to actually perform the best. So actually test it out and try to figure out with those kind of tools.
Yeah, before the whole power tuning tool, it was pretty much a trial and error. Now it's very much data driven. So going back to Alma Media and how you got to using serverless, I know you also mentioned that there's a lot of APIs and stuff like that, but there's also a lot of other things as well. I think you mentioned the step functions, you mentioned a lot of data pipelines as well. Are there any other sort of particular highlights and the success stories that you want to share?
Well, of course, as you mentioned, the APIs are the big thing, and especially for the team I work with, is that I have to say that the first time when you sort of had this, we did those, classic REST APIs with API Gateway and Lambda and Dynamo and things like that. But once you start seeing them serving traffic like of millions or tens or hundreds of millions requests a month, and without no problem, that's a great feeling at sort of say to me that okay, serverless is the way to go. But some of the not so common use cases necessarily, but that are still sort of I'm beginning to see more and more around the companies. One you mentioned is using step functions to control like SageMaker training and how the model is used and where the results are put and things like that. That's one thing. I don't think that step functions per se are really that much used in Alma, but I'd say they are increasing. And generally speaking, I think there's this, I don't know who coined the term, but someone called it functionless, that you don't really use Lambda functions that much. Instead, you sort of integrate different AWS services directly in some cases. So I think that kind of a stuff is probably, I don't believe it in 100% that we're not going to write any code anymore or anything like that. But I guess like using more and more like AWS, managed services that you don't really need to write that much code to integrate things is probably going to increase. And to that point, sort of a shout out to the previous or the older episode where there was the Lego guys like Sheen and Nicole that I heard about the event bridge actually in the same Stockholm community day that we met about the Sheen's talk. He talked about the event bridge there and AWS event bridge, and I found it really interesting. And we're just beginning to look at it and starting like first implementations with it, and it's looking good. And I suspect that will probably change quite a lot how we do like internal integrations between different services living in different AWS accounts. That most of the time is just events being passed along. So why send an HTTP request when you can use something like a bit more robust like service that is more native to AWS and has this IAM policy controls and things like that. So that's probably something that we're going to see a lot more in Alma.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I've seen that in the more and more now as well. Quite a few people now has told me this phrase: use Lambda to transform, not to transport data. And certainly within AWS, you've got lots of services that can directly integrate with other services. API Gateway has got service proxies. You have step functions that can integrate with SNS and SQS and DynamoDB. You also have AppSync nowadays. If all you're doing is just CRUD against DynamoDB data, then AppSync can do most of that for you without having to needing to write custom code in Lambda, which is great. And I definitely think there's more of a trend towards that. Another thing that this pattern I'm starting to see more and more. Last week I spoke with Goiko Asik. He's also talked about how for a while now he's had this pattern where he will have the front end talk directly to AWS DynamoDB once a client has authenticated against Cognito identity pool and got a temporary IAM credential. So bypasses the API gateway and Lambda all together because for him, all his API was doing was authentication, which IAM and DynamoDB already does. So there's no point going through another layer of compute and resources and cost just for authentication.
Yeah, that's an interesting use case, and I've seen few examples around the interwebs about that. I don't think we have done exactly that kind of a setup, but I would say that we're probably not gonna do the like go full on with just directly clients calling the, let's say, a database. That would be interesting if you're already doing an IAM authentication there. It's definitely a good. I would say it's a good idea to do it directly. But again, sort of coming back to that bit of a previous point, I'll see us like using that integration from various services directly to, without the Lambda. As you said, Lambda should not be used for just transport. It should be used for transform. So that I think we're gonna be using more and more, and already using. But that's an interesting approach about the clients directly calling, let's say, a DynamoDB.
It's definitely very different to the traditional thinking in terms of, well, we need an API in front of everything, which is, I think it's definitely a food for thought and definitely something that's worthwhile exploring in a lot of different cases.
I feel that might be something that people who are using the Amplify framework might be probably doing a lot more than the rest of us, let's say. That's just my assumption. I have no real facts about it, but
We see, we see. Um, so you mentioned you've got over 100 websites, you've got 280 developers. That's quite a significant size team. How are your teams organized and set up? Do you have like a centralized ops team that manages infrastructure and governance, or is everyone just responsible for their own AWS accounts and for their own websites and systems?
yeah, basically have, well, as I said, we have multiple teams here, and we pretty much have quite independent teams in general speaking, not even speaking by terms of AWS governance. That we only sort of, our default cloud solution is to use AWS, and for web frontends consider React.js and that kind of thing. But teams are pretty independent in, like, generally speaking. But and there's also they sort of have responsibility for their own AWS accounts. But we also do have some company-wide like governance, that we are using AWS organizations, and we have a certain way of provisioning accounts, and we use stack sets to sort, and automation on top of that to sort of distribute these certain guardrail type of things like guard duty or cloud chain locking, that's centralized locking to a specific account, and things like that we do company wide. And we also have basically each team, that at least each unit has like a few persons that are a lot more comfortable with AWS and have a strong experience on it, and like got from the sort of maintenance side and things like that. So we do have this like that we do collaborate a lot, that we have these ideas from the from the people who do more of the governance side. We have that, hey, we'd like to implement this kind of a thing, and we sort of discuss it with together, and things like that. So we do have some centralized governance, but mostly it's that the teams are quite responsible for their accounts. And one reason being for that is that um, I hate to use the word legacy because it always has like some negative sound, but legacy in a good sense, because we have long running businesses. So we, as I said, we started moving AWS in 2012. So there are AWS accounts that have quite a long history already, and there are many types of, we have, as I said, we have hundreds of accounts, but there isn't like one way of setting up the accounts. There are like, no, well, there's one way of setting new accounts, but there's like different kind of a setups in the accounts that we have. One thing that I'd really sort of, I'm almost jealous of, that of people who sort of get to the point that they are tasked with setting up an organization today, like like set up an organization with all the best practices and all the latest tools, then you can use the control tower, landing zone, and every tool out of the box from AWS. But since we have a long history, we had to come up with our own solution to various things, and that sort of uh, reflects in some places that we can, let's say, use some of the latest stuff from AWS organization side. But we use them, and teams are quite responsible for their accounts.
Yeah, I always prefer the having autonomous teams and having some centralized, I guess, teams like SRE or security teams that is a pool model where teams can ask for help and guidance and work together, as opposed to like being a gatekeeper that, oh, you can't
Yeah.
deploy unless we say so. And that kind of model just never works for me when it comes to a large company.
Yeah, no, that's definitely something we don't want. That having a separate for us, we think that the teams should be, I guess you could say that they're DevOps teams or something like that, that they should be really autonomous in that sense, that they are the ones who develop the features, they are the ones who sort of have to think about how they put the infrastructure together, and they are the ones who have to monitor and operate the service, because they have the best know-how how to do it. And if you start separating, if you have separate team that sort of manages the deployment and the production and things like that, usually it's a barrier for like development speed, that your agility drops and you can't push new features fast enough and things like that. So definitely I as well prefer automated, not automated teams, but autonomous teams, that but there should be always some centralized support, yeah, from the governance side of things and security aspects, as you said.
So switching gears slightly, you are also a heavy user of AppSync, which is something that I have been getting to myself quite a bit the last couple of months, and it's really been growing on me. So what have been your sort of general experience with AppSync so far? What sort of works well for you and what hasn't?
Well, sort of when getting started, I think we've been using AppSync for, I don't know, a couple years now, and I think when getting started, it was the we sort of made an quite a like we made a switch to GraphQL, not switch. We still do a lot of RESTful APIs, but especially my team, we sort of considered that, okay, now what kind of APIs we were supposed to build in near future, and saw that they were probably quite data heavy, and saw the value of adding GraphQL into the mix. And then we sort of started looking things, and I don't know, the building a GraphQL server yourself, you even using like the best possible libraries and things like that, it's sort of, at least at the time, it sort of felt like unnecessary job. um, then taking on AppSync, it has its own quirks, of course, but it's sort of, you don't have to think about that much about how all kinds of I don't know, validation logic and things like that yourself, and how you configure like resolvers in your code, because it sort of manages that for you. You sort of point out that this field or this query uses this function, a bit simplified, of course, but in essence. So that was why we sort of got started with it, why we've sort of why we still keep using it and keep developing new features with it. I think it's the as some people have said, as it's like an API gateway for the GraphQL world. So it's a serverless product, and once you sort of, the biggest benefit of serverless is, I think, is that once you sort of set it up first time, it usually keeps on working. So it has been keeping on working, and it's nowadays the biggest GraphQL API we have is serving around 150 million monthly transactions. So it has worked fine. We haven't had any issues with it, and even though at the time when we started using it, there were some people saying that it's slow or has a huge latencies, but we haven't noticed that. Of course, I have to say we've only used like relatively simple things with the AppSync. We haven't used the pipeline resolvers or anything complex like that. That we usually have either a field or a query that is assigned to a certain resolver that is a Lambda function, and we write our Lambda functions quite often with Go language or Golang, and yeah, it has worked as fine. I think the biggest pain points with it is the sort of lack of local development or mocking the AppSync locally. I know there's some kind of a tools in the Amplify community or in the Amplify scene that you can sort of mock AppSync environment, but then you have to have the whole project done with Amplify, and we haven't used Amplify, so that's not really a solution. There might be some hacks around it and things like that, but at least I haven't figured it out yet. So the local development thing is of course a bit challenging. You have to actually just think about what the event looks like, and then send the event against your Lambda function locally if you want to test it. But that's probably the biggest challenge so far I've seen with AppSync.
Yeah, that's pretty consistent with my personal experience as well. As for the testing, I'll do the same as you. When I've got Lambda functions, which I don't have that many, most of the time it's just a simple resolver that does the DynamoDB get item or put item or query. Those kind of just works. I mean, you can't just take the template and just change the parameters and they just work. They don't really go wrong very much. So for those, mostly I just have end-to-end tests. So after I deploy, I hit the real GraphQL endpoints. I work through the sort of user stories, registration process, all of that, make sure all of that is working end-to-end. And for my Lambda functions, that's where I tend to have problems. I have local tests for my function. I invoke it against the real third-party services that I'm talking to. Could be Cognito, could be Auth0, could be whatever service I'm using. And those are tested locally before I deploy, but otherwise I just hit the real thing once it's deployed, and then that's most of my testing for GraphQL. And I think that works fine. It's not been something that's really gets in the way of my working. Certainly, I don't find that, like I said, the problems tend to be in my code, not in the AppSync.
Yeah, just one thing I sort of I can't say it's a necessarily negative thing about AppSync, but something I've been constantly thinking about, because I sort of compare AppSync to API Gateway quite a lot, which is a fair comparison because they are one is for RESTful world and one is for GraphQL, and there has been something. I have had this feeling a few times that sort of AppSync is sort of lagging behind on features and on feature development compared to API Gateway. And there has been several times that I've sort of thought that maybe I should put like maybe there's a use case that some use case could have been solved better if I've had the API Gateway in front of AppSync. And yeah, that's a valid thing to do. But then you get to a situation that if you have a high traffic website, and both of those are priced by transaction, so around $4 per million requests. So then you're doubling your transaction price just to get, let's say, one or two features from API Gateway.
Yeah, sure. I guess there's no custom Lambda authorizer. That's probably one thing that I miss when it comes to AppSync, which is useful when you're not using Cognito as the authentication. But other than that, I actually find there's a lot of things that AppSync does for me. And this is speaking from personal experience working on a very recent project where I started off with API Gateway, and then I find myself spending a whole week implementing group-based authentication with Cognito and API Gateway, which I just get out of the box with AppSync, and then I spend a couple of days working out how to do the automated documentation generation, the request model, and there's no response validation, which I have to do in my code, which again just out of the box with AppSync. So there's a lot of things I find myself I don't have to do when I'm just doing stuff with AppSync. Equally, I guess there are features that I think are still a bit missing. One thing that's still I think it's really missing is AppSync's caching. It doesn't support nested resolvers very well. In fact, it just doesn't work because you can't use the source in the cache keys. But from talking to Ed Lima on Twitter, he says that that's something that they are actively working on. So I know it's coming, and when it does, then it'll be another big win for us.
Yeah, good that you sorry to interrupt, but I decided good that you mentioned the absent caching. That even though it's limits, it's still a great feature to have. The actually the caching was one of the big sort of my biggest complaints before they released it. That I sort of felt that was like a really obvious thing missing from AppSync, and now we luckily have it, and we're using it in a couple of projects, and we are in those cases we're satisfied how it works really well.
Yeah, in my previous job at the Zone, we also elected AppSync, I think about last year, about 12 months ago, for another very high throughput scenario where we were looking at AppSync's subscriptions. We're looking at the AppSync for some of the just basic query, and the lack of caching was a big one for us because this was a website that, the sports streaming app that had 1 point something million concurrent users at peak. So everyone polling every couple of seconds, that's going to be expensive. So we need caching, right?
Yeah, 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 and also it's a big like philosophical let's say a philosophical thing to have caching in AppSync, because the caching was always the point that everybody wanted to point out. If you say that, okay, we're going to use GraphQL, so they always had the misconception that you can't cache GraphQL requests and responses, even though there are multiple places you can cache them. But now having a cache in AppSync as well was sort of the final nail in the, well, not the final nail in the coffin, that's a really bad expression there, but the final point that made you able to say that yes, you can cache GraphQL.
Yep, and the work they did on the scaling the subscriptions, that was also amazing as well. Because before they had the native WebSockets, they had a limit of about 10,000 connected devices, which for us were just way, way, way below what we needed. But now they can scale that to tens of millions connected devices. They've done some amazing work on the AppSync the last 12 months, I have to say. And it has been a really joy to work with for me personally on a couple of projects. So we talked a lot about sort of the different things you guys are doing. So overall, what would you say are some of the biggest benefit you guys have found with serverless? Because you started your journey in 2012, on AWS, I guess, using EC2, and I guess maybe at some point you decided to switch to serverless. What has been the sort of the biggest benefit to Alma Media as an organization from that switch?
Yeah, and I have to sort of add to there that I think we're doing like this serverless first, because we're not like 100% is serverless. There are, for example, one team that has a really long experience with using Beanstalk, and they are using Beanstalk to power their front like web applications and front ends. Because why change if it's working for you and you have a good knowledge on that? So we do have all sorts of setups still, but yeah, we sort of like to think that quite a many of us are now thinking in the serverless first manner, that we sort of at the beginning of a project we think that okay, that the default solution should be serverless and managed services, and only if there's some really special requirement that there isn't that many these days, we should probably look into EC2 based workflows. But I think the biggest are, of course, the obvious ones: the development speed, and you can just, and it's not out of the box. Using serverless doesn't mean that you increase your development speed, but we see this as the, because you don't have to look after your EC2 instances and figure out how you scale them and things like that, and how you monitor and how you patch and things like that. So we sort of see that the time sort of saved from that is time that can be put forth to uh, developing new stuff. That's one aspect. Then there's also the total cost of ownership, TCO, as they say, is that okay? Sometimes when you start looking at serverless, it might not actually be like super cheap. Depends on of what your scale is, but because some things are priced by the transaction amount, so it might look that okay, this might become expensive at some point. But you sort of tend to forget in those situations that even if you used like EC2 based workflows, you still, as you grow and grow, you still tend to get more expensive, because again you have to think about how you scale things and how you operate and how you monitor and how you patch and things like that. So that's one part of them. But then there's also like you get like different environments free. So in traditional workflows, you often have maybe, let's say, development environment and production environment, or just a few environments. But with serverless, you can have basically feature environments that sort of that your CI triggers from, let's say, a Git branch. Like we use that if there's a feature slash prefix in the Git branch, the CI will actually create a new and totally new environment. Not in every project, of course, but in some projects. So because you pay by the transaction, you get the development and feature environments that there can be multiple. They are basically free. So that's a nice thing. Then I sort of always say the best part of serverless, as I probably said already in the beginning of this podcast, that the best part of serverless is that it usually keeps on working. That with because the Lambda functions that are really short-lived, there usually isn't any state creep or like bugs that sort of appear after time, because don't really, the containers don't really live that long. So usually the problems with serverless products or the services that we've done in a serverless manner, they are usually problems that arise almost directly after deployments, that there has been some coding error that our tests and QA and something like that didn't catch, and we only noticed it in after we deployed. I always prefer that kind of errors like that happen, that deployment basically breaks something. I prefer those kind of errors always over the ones that happen suddenly sometime later on, because those are usually the weekends and holidays and things like that. So I that's why what like the service model, that once you set it up, it usually keeps on working. And then also I'd say that one thing I see, and I actually have a good example on this, is that using serverless, it sort of makes the blast radius, as they call it, smaller. So if you have some kind of a problem, it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole system crashes. It often is that a one request or few requests doesn't work, that they sort of error in some way. We had a few years back, we had this serverless, which was service that was on EC2, and I think it was in Beanstalk, and it basically provided for our front ends that showed something like weather data and things like that. If a user gave the location, it would resolve a city and maybe a street or something like that. Not street, but city and country and the state and things like that from it. And and we used third-party service there, but we did some data processing in between. And then July actually is quite a popular, basically like quite a popular vacation month here in Finland. Basically, some could say that the whole country is closed during July. So people tend to go to countryside and to coast and to islands and things like that, places that don't necessarily have an exact address. So when people used our services that had this like geolocation service in the background for weather and stuff like that, so there was a coding error in the system. And if the third-party service didn't return a valid address, the system sort of failed totally. And that resulted that actually, because there was enough of those failing requests, the whole service went down. And sort of a learning from that was that, okay, that was a coding error from our end, should not have happened in the first place, yes, but coding errors do happen. But if it were a serverless implementation, only the requests that had been only the requests that didn't have the valid address would have been affected. So that was what we sort of came up from it. So that it can sometimes sort of limit the blast radius also. So that's one benefit of serverless that doesn't get talk about that much. But there are several benefits that we think that it just keeps working, the total cost of ownership, and we feel that it allows us to develop stuff faster. Those are the points.
Yeah, that built-in isolation is, I guess, like I said, a bit of underhyped feature of serverless that if something goes wrong, it just affects one function or one container running your code, and it just automatically recovers from that failure the next request that comes in anyway. So what about things that didn't work quite well? Well, are there any? What are some of the sort of biggest pitfalls or mistakes that you wish you knew when you started?
Yeah, I guess all sort of comes down to that when you're doing when you're using serverless in mentality in your in your product development, it also sort of boils down to good planning. It sometimes can be hard, especially when you're starting. Especially when you're starting, it's you can't always know all the sort of dependencies. Like for example, cost wise, there can be some not hidden costs, but costs that are hard to anticipate if you're inexperienced in serverless. We've been sort of showing that effect in couple times. I can give two concrete examples. The first one probably being the CloudWatch, and actually the second one also relates to CloudWatch. But the first CloudWatch problem was that we had a Lambda function that was called quite often, and it used the CloudWatch metrics API to publish a metric. So it called this CloudWatch put metric data API or operation. And that's actually somewhat costly operation. And because we were talking, I don't remember, was it tens or hundreds of millions of requests per month. So we did that metric operation, put metric data operation each request. That ended up costing like it was almost 60% of our monthly bill was just because of that put metric data operation. So you have to sort of think about in serverless almost everything is priced per transaction. So you sort of have to think about the dependencies of these transactions, that if you're calling lambda for X amount, what things are the lambda calling and things like that you have to take into account. Uh, that's almost a similar kind of example where the culprit was Lambda and CloudWatch was that we had somewhat popular API, and we had Lambda at the edge functions attached to the CloudFront distribution there. And basically, those functions did some validation for the data before sending it to the backend because the backend operation was a bit more expensive. So we thought that, okay, let's do it on the edge. And we noticed at some point that, hey, why our CloudWatch bill is again quite expensive? Like, what's causing it? We dig through and found out that, okay, we had forgotten debug logging on in the Lambda at the edge functions. So basically, all the time the Lambda at the edge function was invoking, it logged the payload event, which can be somewhat massive, especially coming from CloudFront events and other things as well. So that ended up actually causing quite a high CloudWatch bill. So always check what things are you logging and use like logging framework or logging library. I always say that always use logging library because it's easier then to define that, okay, if production is if an environment is production, then maybe only log like errors and maybe warnings or something like that. And then in other environments like staging or development or feature branches or what have you, you can then do all the debug logging. And we actually have a little trick there that in production, in some APIs, you can put, if it's a GraphQL API or in REST, you can put it in header. You can put like this one debug flag, so you can get like full logs for the even for the production request for single request, but you don't have to log everything in a larger scale. So being aware of these, like again, I don't want to say hidden costs because they are documented in the AWS pages, but they are sometimes quite hard to understand, especially once you're like first time coming to serverless. So those I think have been the challenges.
Yeah, the CloudWatch cost thing, that is something that definitely a lot of people got hit. I've seen people spend 10 times more on CloudWatch logs alone to compared to what they pay for Lambda and API Gateway because of the whole debug logging getting forgotten and things like that. So nowadays, what I typically do is I've got some libraries I've developed which in production you would be logging at error or info or warning or whatever, but we sample the debug logs as say 1% of the invocation. So you do always still have some population of your debug logs in case something happens, and you hopefully will still have the debug logs to help you. And also work with correlation ID so that if you've got a whole call chain or function calling other functions through SNS, SQS, or whatever, those decisions gets passed along. So every function along that call chain will respect the decision the first function made regarding should we enable debug logging for this invocation. So that really helps a lot in terms of keeping your cost in check, but also still giving you really good visibility. And got another horror story about CloudWatch metrics. You know how CloudWatch metrics counts every distinct combination of dimensions as a unique metric, and it's like 20 cents per month per metric. And I've heard of one company that was by mistake including the request ID as a dimension. So every request was a unique metric. That was so bad. The bill for that company was horrendous.
Those are really it's a real shame. I feel bad for that kind of because again the mistakes happen. We are all humans, and I can say we have had a case where we had a lambda function trigger from S3 and then updating the same object. That wasn't cheap either, I can say. But
Oh, recursion, infinite recursion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Yeah, but that's like one thing that you should really do. Like that was something that wasn't like that could have been like caught with proper code reviews. So always try to and especially when you're like if you're starting, like let's say your company that's switching to serverless and you have your team figuring out, it's good idea to always do like good code reviews, not because you sort of it's the main point isn't that did your teammates screw up or something. That's not the point. The point is to learn from others, and then occasionally you might spot actually something that was a mistake, because we're all human and we do mistakes. So that is something that I always try to tell that people, especially working with serverless and are new to serverless, that it's a complex, even though in some sense serverless is super easy, but it can also be super complex. So when you're learning, don't do it just alone. So use your teammates and do it together. And there are a lot of articles and stuff and out there. So get to read and learn, and don't just jump right into it. I have, for example, I have personally, I'm a bit of a, I can't really wait to get started. So I often start doing and then do something and do a mistake. And then I'm like, okay, I should have probably read the docs properly. This is totally explained there. So
Yeah, Joe Emerson, who I actually interviewed on this podcast, he was one of the first people I interviewed on this podcast. He once said that all these articles you read on Medium about serverless lessons learned, how they made some really bad mistake. It can always be summarized as someone who's spent 2 weeks working and 2 days researching, and could have been a lot better, has spent 2 weeks researching and then 2 days working.
yeah, exactly so.
Yeah, and for that recursion thing, I actually ran into that my previous company at the Zone, and what we ended up doing was as part of our suite of tools, which is open source, called the Zone Power Lambda Power Tools. We actually have got a middleware that passes the count in terms of the number of invocations in this code chain as a correlation ID, and incremented it automatically, so that if you ever run into a case where your code chain gets longer than a default number we set up, which is I think like 10 or something, we just stop the invocation and tell you that it's a potential infinite recursion. That's how we are nowadays sort of trying to catch those accidental infinite recursions early, so that you don't find out once you have 5 billion invocations for the month.
Yeah, that's useful. We'll definitely have to check that tool out.
So I think that's everything I wanted to cover for this episode. Is there anything that any sort of personal projects, any books that you're writing about that you'd like to tell us?
Not at the moment. Actually, as I said, it's summer is coming, and my mind is mostly about the summer vacation, thinking mostly about the summer vacation already. But I'm actually I've been blogging in previous years, and I've actually started thinking about, like, I have already a few blog posts waiting. The only thing that is actually preventing me from publishing is that actually I need to first develop my own website, because I'm a purist in that sense that I don't want to publish anywhere else. So that's been the reason. So maybe like after the holidays I will be posting more about some things, even more about serverless and AWS and all sorts of stuff related to development. So I think that's it. So, but I don't have it's probably going to be at aripalo.com address, but it's not, doesn't really, there's nothing at the moment yet. So don't go looking there, but follow me. So I'll probably say something once I have some content online.
Okay. And how can people find you on the social media?
Yeah, I'm basically everywhere. First name, last name. So Ari Palo, basically everywhere. Ari Palo. So in Twitter, I share stuff related to this, and also feel free to connect me in LinkedIn if you're interested in serverless and infrastructure and code and things like that. So you can reach me on those platforms, and I'm probably speaking in. The situation is what it is, but at least maybe in some online conferences later in the year or so.
Okay, sounds good. I will make sure I'll put those links in the show notes when you're ready to share your brand new blog with us.
Yeah.
And it's been a pleasure having you today. And take care and start thinking about your vacation. Hopefully, when things come down a little bit and we can all go and travel.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for the invite here. Always like to talk with other AWS and serverless enthusiasts.
Cool. Take it easy, man.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
That's it for another episode of Real-World Serverless. To access the show notes and the transcript, please go to realworldserverless.com. And I'll see you guys next time.